Over 75% of games beginning with 1, e4, c5. Continue with knight f3. When there are 3 main options for black, 2, d6, 2, knight c6, and 2, e6, lines where white then plays d4, are collectively known as the Open Sicilian, and result in extremely complex positions. White has a lead in development in extra kingside space, which white can use to begin a kingside attack. This is counterbalanced by black's central pawn majority, created by the trade of white's d-pawn for black's c-pawn, and the open c-file, which black uses to generate queenside counterplay. Part 1. Black's most common move after 1, e4, c5, knight f3, is d6. This prepares knight f6, to attack the e-pawn without letting white push it to e5. The game usually continues 3, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, 5, knight c3, sometimes played as 3, knight f6, knight c3, c takes d4, knight takes d4, giving the same result. Black can then choose between 4 major variations, in order of decreasing popularity. These are the knight or 5, a6, dragon 5, g6, classical knight c6, and Scheveningen 5, e6. The Venice attack e5, bishop b5, and capricic variation bishop d7, are rarely played. There are a few ways for either side to deviate. After 3, c takes d4, white occasionally plays queen takes d4, the check-over variation, intending to meet knight c6, with bishop b5, bishop d7, bishop takes c6, when white hopes that his lead in development compensates for black's bishop pair. Black can avoid this line by playing knight f6. When knight c3, c takes d4, knight takes d4, returns to main lines. However, white has the option of 4, d takes c5, when black can play either knight takes e4, or queen a5. Another unusual sideline is 3, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, e3, the prince variation, which tries to maintain the option of c4, with a Maroczy bind formation. Najdorf variation, 5, a6. The Najdorf variation is black's most popular system in the Sicilian defense. Najdorf's intention with 5, a6, was to prepare e5 on the next move to gain space in the center. The immediate e5, however, is met by bishop b5, when black must either play bishop d7, or knight b d7. Bishop d7 allows white to exchange off black's slight-squared bishop, after which the d5 square becomes very weak, but knight b d7 allows 7, knight f5, when black can only save the d-pawn by playing the awkward a6, bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, in both cases, white's game is preferable. Thus, by playing 5, a6, black deprives white of the check on b5, so that e5 might be possible next move. In general, a6 also prevents white's knights from using the b5 square, and helps black create queenside play by preparing the b5 pawn push. This plan of a6, followed by e5, represents black's traditional approach in the Najdorf variation. Later, Garry Kasparov also adopted the a6 move order, but with the idea of playing e6 rather than e5. Kasparov's point is that the immediate e6, the Scheveningen variation, allows g4, which is white's most dangerous line against the Scheveningen. By playing 5, a6, first, black temporarily prevents white's g4 thrust and waits to see what white plays instead. Often, play will eventually transpose to the Scheveningen variation. Currently, white's most popular weapon against the Najdorf is 6, bishop e3. This is called the English attack, because it was popularized by English grandmasters Murray Chandler, John Nunn and Nigel Short in the 1980s. White's idea is to play f3, queen d2, g4, and castle queenside in some order. Black can respond with 6, e6, 6, e5, or 6, knight g4. To prevent knight g4, white sometimes starts with f3, instead. A related attacking idea for white is bishop e3, e6, g4, known as the Hungarian attack or Perini attack. Formerly, 6, bishop g5, e6, e4, was the main line of the Najdorf when white threatens to attack the pinnered knight with e5. Black can simply break the pin with bishop e7, when white usually plays queen f3, and 9. Castle. Some of black's alternatives are 7. Queen b6, the poisoned pawn variation popularized by Fischer, and 7. b5, the Polugevsky variation, which has the tactical point e5, d takes e5, if takes e5, queen c7, e takes f6, queen e5, winning the bishop and return for the knight. White has other choices on the 6th move. 6. Bishop e2, prepares to castle kingside and is a quieter alternative compared to 6. Bishop e3, and 6. Bishop g5. Efim Gelar was an early proponent of this move, after which black can stay in pure Najdorf territory with e5, or transpose to the Scheveningen with 6. e6. Other possibilities for white include 6. f4. 6. Bishop c4, the Fischer attack. 6. g3, and 6. h3, the Adams attack, named after Weaver Adams, which was used several times by Bobby Fischer. Dragon variation. 5. g6. In the dragon variation, black fianchettos a bishop on the h8, a1 diagonal. It was named by Fyodor Dostoyevsky in 1901, who noticed a resemblance between black's kingside pawn structure, pawns on d6, e7, f7, g6, and h7, and the stars of the Draco constellation. White's most dangerous try against the dragon is the Yugoslav attack, characterized by bishop e3, bishop g7, f3, castle queen d2, knight c6, when both castle queenside and bishop c4 may be played. This variation leads to extremely sharp play and is ferociously complicated, since the players castle on opposite wings and the game becomes a race between white's kingside attack and black's queenside counterattack. White's main alternatives to the Yugoslav attack are 6. Bishop e2, the classical variation, and 6. e4, the Levenfish attack. Classical variation. 5. Knight c6. Black simply brings his knight to its most natural square and defers, for the moment, the development of his king's bishop. White's most common reply is 6. Bishop g5, the Richter-Rosser attack. The move bishop g5 was Kurt Richter's invention, threatening to double black's pawns after bishop takes f6, and forestalling the dragon by rendering g6 unplayable. After e6, Vsevolod-Rosser introduced the modern plan of queen d2 and castle queenside in the 1930s. White's pressure on the d6 pawn often compels black to respond to bishop takes f6 with g takes f6, rather than recapturing with a piece, for example, the queen on d8, that also has to defend the d-pawn. This weakens his kingside pawn structure, in return for which black gains the two bishops, plus a central pawn majority, though these assets are difficult to exploit. Another popular variation is 6. Bishop c4, which brings the bishop to an aggressive square. Black usually plays 6. e6, to limit the range of white's bishop, but white can eventually put pressure on the e6 pawn by pushing his f-pawn to f5. After the move 7. Bishop e3, bishop e7, white can either castle kingside, the Fischer-Zinn attack, named after Bobby Fischer and Russian master Veniamin Zinn, who originated it in the 1930s, or queenside with queen e2, and castle queenside, the Vladimirovic attack. Instead of e6, black can also try Benko's move 6. Queen b6, which forces white to take a decision over the knight at d4, and typically leads the game into more positional lines than the razor-sharp, highly theoretical Zinn and Vladimirovic variations. 6. Bishop e2 allows black to choose among e5, the dynamic Boleslavsky variation. 6. e6 transposing to the Scheveningen variation, and g6 transposing to the classical variation of the dragon. Scheveningen variation. 5. e6. In the Scheveningen variation, black contents himself with a small center, pawns on d6 and e6, rather than e5, and prepares to castle kingside. In view of this, Paul Kurz introduced 6. g4, the Kurz attack, in 1943. White intends to drive away the black knight with g5. If black prevents this with h6, which is the most common answer, White has gained king side space and discouraged black from castling in that area, and may later play bishop g2. If the complications after g4 are not to white's taste, a major alternative is 6. Bishop e2, a typical line being a6, castle bishop e7, e4, castle 9, b3, and 6, e4, are also common. While theory indicates that black can hold the balance in the Kerr's attack, players today often prefer to avoid it by playing 5. a6, first, an idea popularized by Kasparov. However, if white is determined to play the g4 thrust, he may prepare it by responding to a6, with h3, as Fischer is sometimes played, or 6, rook g1. Part 2. Knight c6 is a natural developing move, and also prepares knight f6. Like d6, black stops white from replying e5. After d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. Black's most common move is knight f6, when white usually replies knight c3. At this point, black can play d6, transposing to the classical variation, 5. e5, the Sveshnikov variation, or 5. e6, transposing to the 4 knights variation. Apart from knight f6, black's most important moves are 4. e6, transposing to the Timon variation, 4. g6, the accelerated dragon, and 4. e5, the Kalashnikov variation. Rarer choices include 4. Queen c7, which may later transpose to the Timon variation, and 4. Queen b6, the Grivas variation. The Sveshnikov variation for knight f6, knight c3, e5, was pioneered by Evgeny Sveshnikov and Gennady Timoshenko in the 1970s. Before their efforts, the variation was called the Lasker-Pelikan variation. Emanuel Lasker played it once in his World Championship match against Karl Schlechter, and Georg Pelikan played it a few times in the 1950s, but Sveshnikov's treatment of the variation was the key to its revitalization. The move 5. e5 seems anti-positional as it leaves black with a backwards d-pawn and a weakness on d5. Also, black would have to accept the doubled f-pawns in the main line of the opening. The opening was popularized when Sveshnikov saw its dynamic potential for black in the 1970s and 80s. Today, it is extremely popular among grandmasters and amateurs alike. Though some lines still give black trouble, it has been established as a first-rate defense. The main line after e5 runs as follows: 6. Knight d. b5, the theoretically critical move, threatening knight d6. All other moves are considered to allow black easy equality. 6. Knight takes c6, is usually met by b takes c6, when black's extra pawn in the center gives him good play. Alternatively, even 6. d takes c6, queen takes d8, king takes d8, is sufficient for equality. 6. Knight b3, can be well met by bishop b4, threatening to win white's pawn on e4. 6. Knight f3, can also be well met by bishop b4, threatening to win white's pawn on e4. 6. Knight f5, allows d5, e takes d5, bishop takes f5, d takes c6, b takes c6, queen f3, queen d7. 6. Knight d. e2 can be met by either bishop c5, or 6. Bishop b4. Here, black plays d6, preventing knight d6, bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, when white's pair of bishops give him the advantage. 7. Bishop g5, white gets ready to eliminate the knight on f6, further weakening black's control over the d5 square. a6, black forces white's knight back to a3. The immediate bishop takes f6, forces 8. G takes f6, when after knight a3, black can transpose into the main line with b5, or deviate with f5. b5 was Sveshnikov's innovation, controlling c4, and threatening b4, forking white's knights. Previously, black played 8. Bishop e6, the bird variation, which allowed the a3 knight to return to life with 9. Knight c4. The entire variation up to b5 is referred to as the Chelyabinsk variation. After 8. b5. White usually parries the threat of b4 by playing bishop takes f6 or knight d5. After 9. Bishop takes f6. queen takes f6, 10, knight d5, queen d8, fails to c4, b4, now, b takes c4, 12, knight takes c4, is good for white, who threatens, 13, queen a4, so after black plays 11, b4, white continues with, queen a4, bishop d7, knight b5 it takes b5, queen takes a8 queen takes a8, knight c7, king d8, knight takes a8 and the knight escapes via b6. Is forced, when white continues g takes f6, knight d5, white's powerful knight on d5, and black's shattered king-side pawn structure are compensated by black's bishop pair and white's offside knight on a3. Also, black has the plan of playing f5, followed by f takes e4, and f5, with the second f-pawn, which would give him good control of the center. An alternative plan is to play 10, bishop g7, followed by knight e7, to immediately trade off white's powerful knight. This line is known as the Novosibirsk variation. Instead of bishop takes f6, white can also play 9, knight d5, which usually leads to quieter play. White decides not to double black's f-pawns and the game usually continues bishop e7, 10, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, c3, when white has maintained his knight on d5, by trading off black's knight on f6, and prepares to bring the knight on a3, back into play with the maneuver knight a3, to c2, to e3. Another line is knight takes e7, fighting for control of d5, and not fearing the doubled pawns. Knight takes e7, 11. Bishop takes f6, gx f6. A quick draw is possible after 9. Queen a5, bishop d2, in order to prevent 10. Knight takes e4, queen d8, bishop g5, queen a5, etc. In order to avoid this, white can play 11. Knight takes f6, or c4. Accelerated dragon, 4. g6. Like the standard dragon variation, black develops his bishop to g7, in the accelerated dragon. The difference is that black avoids playing d7, to d6, so that he can later play d7, to d5, in one move if possible. For example, if white tries to play in the style of the Yugoslav attack with 5. Knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, e3, castle, queen d2, d5, equalizes immediately. When white does play knight c3, it is usually with the idea of continuing bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, bishop c4, castle bishop d3, forestalling any tricks involving knight takes c4, and d5, followed by kingside castling. The critical test of black's move order is 5. c4, the Maroczy bind. White hopes to cramp black's position by impeding the d7, d5 and b7, b5 pawn thrusts. Generally, this line is less tactical than many of the other Sicilian variations, and play involves much strategic maneuvering on both sides. After c4, the main line runs bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, knight c3, and now castle, or knight g4, is most frequently played. Kalashnikov variation 4. e5, knight b5, d6. The Kalashnikov variation, Encyclopedia of Chess Openings, code B32, is a close relative of the Sveshnikov variation, and is sometimes known as the Neo-Sveshnikov. The move 4. e5, has had a long history. Louis Charles Mahy de la Bourdonnais used it in his matches against Alexander MacDonald in 1834, and it was also popular for a short time in the 1940s. These earlier games focused on the Lowenthal variation with 4. e5, knight b5, a6, knight d6, bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, queen f6, where black gives up the two bishops to achieve a lead in development. However, the move fell out of use once it was determined that white kept the advantage in these lines. The Lowenthal variation is similar to the Kalashnikov, but the reply to knight b5 is a6. Only in the late 1980s did black players revive knight b5 with d6. This is the Kalashnikov variation. The ideas in this line are similar to those in the Sveshnikov. Black accepts a backward pawn on d6 and weakens the d5 square but gains time by chasing the knight. The difference between the two variations is that black has not developed his knight to f6, and white has not brought his knight out to c3, so both players have extra options. Black may forego knight f6, in favor of knight e7, for example after 6, knight 1 c3 a6, knight a3, b5, knight d5, knight g, e7, which avoids white's plan of bishop g5, and bishop takes f6, to inflict doubled f-pawns on black. Or, black can delay bringing out the knight in favor of playing bishop e7, to g5, or the quick f5. On the other hand, white has the option of 6, c4, which solidifies his grip on d5, and clamps down on b5, but leaves the d4 square slightly weak. Part 3, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. Black's move e6 gives priority to developing the dark squared bishop. Black has 3 main moves: knight c6, the Timon variation, 4, a6, the Kan variation, and 4, in f6. After knight f6, knight c3, black can transpose to the Scheveningen variation with d6, or play knight c6, the 4 knights variation. Also note that after knight f6, white cannot play e5, because of queen a5, followed by queen takes e5. Timon variation, named after Mark Timonov, e6. Black develops the knight to a natural square and keeps his options open regarding the placement of his other pieces. One of the ideas of this system is to develop the king's bishop to b4 or c5. White can prevent this by knight b5, d6, when c4 leads to a version of the Maroczy bind favored by Karpov. The resulting position after c4, knight f6, 7. Knight 1 c3, a6, 8. Knight a3, b6 is a type of hedgehog. The Kasparov Gambit 8. d5 was played in the World Chess Championship 1985, but virtually disappeared from master praxis. 5. Knight c3 is more common nowadays than knight b5, when d6 normally transposes to the Scheveningen variation, and 5. Knight f6 is the 4 knights variation. Independent moves for black are 5. Queen c7, and 5. a6, with the former being the more usual move order seen in recent years, as after 5. a6, knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop d3, despite its apparent simplicity, has given black difficulties in reaching equality. Timonov's idea was to play 5. a6, preventing knight b5, followed by knight g, e7 and knight takes d4. Paulsen variation runs e4, c5, knight f3, e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. 4. a6 named after Ilya Kan. By playing 4. a6, black prevents knight b5, and prepares an eventual b5 advance. White's most popular reply is knight c3, when black's development of the kingside knight often takes focus as playing knight f6, can be met with e5, which both creates a black weakness on the d6 square and causes the black knight a disadvantageous move. So black normally plays a move to control the e5 square, preventing the advancing pawn. The main Kan move is queen c7, although 5. Knight c6, transposing into a Timonov. 5. d6, transposing into a Scheveningen can occur. 5. b5, and create pressure from the queen side with the idea of playing b4, attacking the c3, knight or bishop b7, building pressure along the long white squared diagonal. An alternative 5th move for white is to play 5. Bishop d3, when after bishop c5, knight b3, and now black can either retreat to bishop e7, or queen g4, makes black's kingside problematic, or 6. b7. 5. c4 is also possible with a Maroczy bind setup. 4 knights variation. Knight f6, knight c3, knight c6. The 4 knights variation is mainly used as a way of getting into the main line Sveshnikov variation, reached after 6. Knight d, b5, d6, bishop f4, e5, bishop g5, a6, knight a3, b5. The point of this move order is to avoid lines such as the Rasolimo variation, bishop b5, or d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, e5, 6. Knight d, b5, d6, knight d5, which are possible in the standard Sveshnikov move order. On the other hand, in the four knights move order, e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, white acquires the extra option of knight takes c6, b takes c6, e5, knight d5, knight e4, so white is not obliged to enter the Sveshnikov. If black is not aiming for the Sveshnikov, e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, and when white plays 6, knight d, b5 black has bishop b4, and a3, bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, d5, e takes d5, e takes d5, leads to a position where black has given up the two bishops but has active pieces and the possibility of playing d5 to d4.